So yesterday we talked about, oh, now my phone is going to play. We we talked what can we replace a child protection system, our current child protection system that currently overly relies on reporting poverty-stricken families for neglect and separating children from their parents. We are beginning the process here at the coalition of looking at a concept and perhaps called villaging, where the community and the church become more involved in preventing children from being separated from their families. And that's why I'd like to introduce you to a community and somebody who's an exhibitor at our table called the Care Portal. I got this in the mail the other day, and I love their outreach. It's called, they say that the power of proximity, transforming lives in our own backyards. And the work that they're doing is amazing. They imagine discovering the neighbor you casually wave to is the very person your generosity is about to transform. Recently, a volunteer from a church in Rensselaer County responded to a Care Portal request for essential items: a car seat, clothing, diapers for a young mom and her newborn. When that volunteer contacted the mom to coordinate services, she learned the family lived right next door to her. With just one phone conversation initiated through the Care Portal, the barriers of unfamiliarity crumbled and a friendship began to grow. And that's a program that we want everybody to learn more about. And that's why I personally invited them to be here as an exhibitor at this conference today. We have somebody from the Capital Region. Can you raise your hand? Tell me your name again. I'm sorry, I should have remembered. Gene Knott. And we also have somebody coming up from New York City. Name is Mark Atkinson. Is he here yet? Okay, but I want you to become familiar with that program. Because Care Portals can be started in a variety of places, but you can use them right now, and it's very, very powerful in terms of preventing kids from coming into foster care to begin with, helping kids go home faster than expected, and also, since so many of us are serving relatives who just having new relatives move in with them, and they need a whole variety of help and services, and the Care Portal could be instrumental to help them as well. So I just wanted to bring that to all your attention because they are here today. I want you also to please consider purchasing two amazing books, and you can see me about it. This is What Maisie Believes, and it is a beautifully illustrated book that features the voice of Maisie, a thoughtful, confident, energetic, happy, and deeply spiritual little girl. Maisie describes aspects of her spirituality through a series of matter-of-fact, simple declarations. And it's a fascinating book, and I think kids could really enjoy this, and also adults relaying messages to their children. And one of the first books that we have seen that has been written by an adopted person, a parent who gave their child up for adoption, relinquished their child for adoption, and an adoptive parent. The three members of that triad put together a book called Adoption Unfiltered, and it's a fascinating book. If anybody wants to learn more about it, see me about it. I'll be at my table in the back there. And when the coalition actually raises funds itself, we put it into programming where we don't have programming. For instance, we have a therapy program where many of the families that we work with do not have access to trauma-informed, adoption-competent therapists. And what we have is a pilot program where we're at least offering families 5 sessions with an adoption-competent, trauma-informed therapist in the hopes that that connection might lead to additional therapy sessions where insurance gets involved, or where families might not mind paying, but at least they would get 5 sessions to go through a real coaching, mentoring thing. And when we raise money, that's one of the things we raise money for. And of course, foster and adoptive parents, particularly foster parents, a lot of times really need advocacy and good legal advice. And last year, when we raised funds, we put enough funds together where we were able to hire an attorney who works for the coalition, who's going to help us on various issues and sometimes on individual cases. And she's here today. She's with us. Her name is Megan. Megan. I always call her Megan. Megan O'Leary. Okay. So she's at a table outside. And the reason why I point those two programs out is because when we raise funds, that's what we use them for. And we are within our goal. We wanted to raise close to $40,000 with this conference, and we're within $1,000 of our goal. So if anybody has any desire to donate anything to make up that $1,000, check out the QR codes, go to our website, click donate, and we really, really appreciate it. And those donations go to something that's really, really good. So I just wanted to share that with you. That's good. And we got a Venmo at the tables. Okay, good. And you can come to the table and Venmo us. All right. So let me see. All right. So now let me get into our keynote speaker. Gretchen Sisson is the author of the recently published book, Relinquished: The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. She's a sociologist and a researcher with advancing new standards in reproductive health, which is part of the Obstetrics, Gynecology, Reproductive Sciences at the University of California at San Francisco. I did that pretty good. All right. Her research examining adoption decision-making after abortion denial as part of that Turnaway study that was cited in the Supreme Court dissent in Dobbs versus Jackson's from Justice Breyer, Kagan, and Sotomayor. And she was quoted in that decision. So she's a very, very well-known and influential person in this field, is what I'm telling you. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, The Nation, All Things Considered, New York Magazine, VOX, and other outlets. Now, Gretchen is here today to bring us information from her new book, Relinquished, but it's also to talk about some of the commonalities that parents who relinquish their children have in common with parents whose children were separated from them by the child protection systems across the United States. So I am looking very forward to her addressing us today, and I'm going to welcome Gretchen to come up here.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you all for having me. I'm really glad to be with you this morning. So what Pat said, in addition to getting out my world's longest job title, is that I'm a researcher in the OBGYN department at UCSF. And so I'm coming to this question, and I came to my work in adoption from a background of reproductive health and justice, which is a little different than where most people come to doing research around adoption. And what initially brought me to this research question was this idea of adoption as an alternative to abortion access, right? The ways that adoption was sort of continually framed as this mutually agreeable common ground in this political conversation, which is what we saw in the oral arguments for Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, and then again in the decision that came out. And of course, as many people in this room know, the questions of how and why adoption happens and the circumstances that lead to it and what it means for people have almost nothing to do with the actual conversations around abortion. But we continually have our elected leaders putting these two things in opposition, in contrast to one another. So a lot of my work is really about attempting to bring the political conversation more in alignment with what the actual lived experiences of people that are impacted by adoption look like. And from that background, because I came to it from this perspective of reproductive decision-making, my work looks at domestic infant adoption. And these are women who have terminated their own parental rights, so not had their rights terminated by the state. Although, as we'll talk about, those systems are getting more and more entangled together. So all of the women that I interviewed for my research relinquished infants for private domestic adoption, this book focuses on women who relinquished from 2000 to 2020, but I interviewed a lot of them who relinquished earlier than that as well, and their conversations informed me. I am going to be reading at some medium length from some of their interviews, because I actually think that you all in this room are really smart. You can come to the same conclusions if you hear the same data and the same stories that I did. So please bear with me for that. But I do want to just start by recognizing the historical roots of family separation and understanding how public and private systems of adoption became two separate systems, who they target, who's impacted, and what that looks like. And in this, I'm drawing really heavily on the work of other scholars, because I'm not a historian, but I think it's important to understand how we got where we are so that we can understand how to reduce harm, how to undo it, how we're going to unravel these really complicated, problematic systems. So in the book, when we look at the history of public adoption, or sorry, I'll start with private adoption, because that's what we're doing. When we look at the history of private adoption, as we know it now, where you have mothers terminating their own parental rights, and then you have families, usually used to be that they would go in foster care, but briefly, and then immediately be adopted. Now, often they are just released from the hospital with prospective adoptive parents before the adoption is finalized. So these infants spend very little of any time in the foster care system. But this system of private adoption is relatively new. Historically, it's only about 130, 40 years old. And that's because before that, when you look earlier, there was no demand for babies. There was no market demand for babies, right? So if you had mothers who were poor and who couldn't afford their children, right, their options were foundling homes, orphan trains. But this wasn't a demand for children as a source of a loving parenting relationship, right? Children were only valued if they could provide market labor, right? So the children on the orphan train were sent west from New York, from Philadelphia, from Boston, mostly New York. And they were used as labor on farms in the Midwest, right? Domestic labor, farm labor. But you didn't see parents seeking to adopt children because they just wanted to raise and love another child as part of their family. There wasn't a value placed on that. You see that shift end of the 19th, early 20th century, where it became you were adopting children, not because you wanted another worker in your household, not because there was an economic benefit of having that child, but because we started to place a value on having children, a sentimental value, an interpersonal value, a familial value on what that relationship looked like. And once we started to do that, there's a sociologist, Viviana Seltzer, who's at Princeton. She did a brilliant work called Pricing the Priceless Child, right? Where we started to see an inherent value in raising children and having family. So we no longer have children. I have 3 children. I didn't have any of them because they added an economic value to my household. And I'm sure many of you who are parenting in this room, that's not why we have children anymore. We don't have them to work on our farm or do, like, it'd be great if they did a few more chores, but that's not why I had them. And so I think that represents a shift, right? Because now when we talk about the value that we place on parenthood, the reasons why people want to adopt, why there is a high market demand for adoptable babies, it's at the root of this commodified parenting relationship that we had. But because this isn't a market-based system, it has historically always been very white. The private adoption system was historically always very white. And so there was a higher market demand for white children. White prospective adoptive parents were more able to pay higher systems. So when you have really high demand, really low supply of babies, that's an expensive system, right? They're willing to pay, that's who can participate. And when you look at adoption, private adoption before Roe versus Wade, most of the women and girls who were relinquishing were white young women and girls. And this was a way of delaying parenthood, right? So they were unmarried. That was socially unacceptable to be a single mother. And so they were relinquishing their children. They were told they were going to go to these maternity homes, have a baby, go back to their lives, forget about the baby. They didn't need to have contact. These were closed, coercive, secretive adoptions. And this was sort of the answer to the situation. Black women were not targeted for private adoption systems because there wasn't a market demand for their children. There were also longer traditions of single motherhood. It wasn't as stigmatized in Black communities, and there were greater systems of kinship support, right? So you have this really racialized white idea of this sort of like independent, self-sufficient, middle-class conformist family that happened in the 1950s and 60s that really created this boom in white children that were available through the private adoption system. None of that means, of course, that communities of color, particularly Black communities and Black families, were protected from family separation. It just wasn't within the private market-based system, right? So you had a family regulation system that came out that separated Black families, but it wasn't because there was a market demand for Black children. It was a way of continuing to police Black families, right? So, of course, family separation in Black communities goes back to American slavery, right? Where you have the separation, the threat of family separation for enslaved families was used as a way of extracting obedience, right? And you see this in the accounts of slave narratives, incidents in the life of a slave girl, where slave owners would tell Black mothers, you need to behave or we're going to sell your children away, right? And so the threat of family separation was a way of imposing additional obedience on Black families. You see this through the Jim Crow era, right? Where in Florida and Louisiana, we have really good, it probably almost certainly happened in other states, but these states had better records. So we actually know what they were doing a little bit more. They said, if you want to avail yourself of the public social safety system, if you want to get welfare benefits at all, if you want to get food stamps or food benefits, then you need to have a social worker, almost always a white social worker, come into your home and make sure you're providing a suitable home for your children, right? And that's the only way that you're going to be able to get these benefits that are actually going to make sure that you can care for these children the way that we want you to. And so what happened is a lot of Black families said, okay, well, we're just not going to get the benefits then, because they knew that they were at risk of losing their children if they participated in that system. So you see that these are additional, this continuation, this way that this system was used as a way of continuing to police and exact social control over Black families. You see that continuation today in the current child welfare system as the primary separator of Black and brown families. Dorothy Roberts, Alan Detlaff have done a lot of work sort of charting this historical trajectory. Similarly, when you look at Native families were not separated within the private adoption system, but they were separated historically through Indian boarding schools, right? This, again, wasn't about making Native children available for private adoption at first. It was about assimilation, right? It was about cultural removal from tribes. This is how we're going to end the tribes. If you take away generations after generations of children, tribes have no future, right? And the tribes recognize that. After the boarding schools closed, which is later than most people think, right? This is the 60s. We were still having boarding schools into the early 70s. Then it transitioned into the Indian Adoption Project. And the Indian Adoption Project was 60s to very early 70s, which was continued to be about these assimilations, the removal of Native children into white adoptive families. The Indian Child Welfare Act ended that and gave tribes the ability to inform where children were going, to put a preference on placing Native children within their own tribes or within any Native family before they were placed outside of the tribal communities. The Indian Child Welfare Act continues to face threats, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The Holland versus Brackeen case that was just decided by the Supreme Court. When I wrote the book, I assumed we were going to lose that case. I had to turn in my manuscript before it was done. Their last edits that I did on the manuscript were going back and deleting my author's note about how we lost the Indian Child Welfare Act, because I was really surprised that we actually kept that one with this court. But grateful that we did. And so I go over all of this history because I think it's important to recognize that the ways that we have separated families throughout American history has been used to accomplish different ends, right? It's used as often as a tool of policing, as a tool of control, to serve market demands, to create assimilation, right? And you have to tease those apart a little bit if you want to understand the root causes of where our current system is. So contextualizing private adoption today. And because of this white history of private adoption that I've talked about, it's really important to understand that is changing, and it's changing really quickly. So as recently as the 1990s, late 1990s, which is when we had the last really good, robust federal data, that was still true. Almost 98% of women participating in the private adoption system were white women. That's not true today. And I apologize that this is so small on this slide. Never know what size projector you're going to be with here. But this is a sample of 8,608 domestic adoptions that occurred between 2011 and 2020. Only 55% of the participating mothers were white. So when you talk about 98% to 55% in 20 years, it's a huge shift in who's actually participating in these systems. About 17% were Black women, small number percentage for Asian American women, about 7% Latina. Apologize for just throwing numbers at you and reading them, but I know that's quite small. Native American is less than 1%. I don't trust, this is my own data, and I still don't trust that number because it's based on reporting, and because of the Indian Child Welfare Act, I have a lot of questions about that number, but that's what we got when we did reporting. And then another 7% are bi or multiracial. I do want to also caveat that this is the racial and ethnic information for the mothers only, right? And of course, having a white mother doesn't mean you're going to have a white child. So we see higher rates of bi and multiracial children that are being placed by white mothers into the private adoption system as well. The age skews a little bit younger than the average birthing population of the United States. There's certainly, I mean, it's about 5% under 16. That's definitely higher than the average birthing population. But the mode sort of is in the 20s, right? So these women are no longer particularly marked by their youth or by being very young. There's definitely some more outliers on the young side, but it's no longer a function primarily of youth that's leading to relinquishment. So what is? Almost 64% of them have less than $5,000 of annual personal income. And none of them have basic income over $55,000, which is about the median income for the US right now. Most of them are unemployed, 55% are unemployed, and 88% are on public health insurance. Which when you look at that as a marker of reliance on public systems and poverty, that is sort of the defining characteristic. Now, I do want to note this $5,000 of income, that's personal income. So if these are young women and they're still living with their own parents, they could be living in a very middle class or affluent household, right? But they don't have control over their own resources. They don't have control over their own money to shape sort of the circumstances of what their lives look like. And I should also say this isn't in here, but sorry, I got two different slides I'm working off of here. That most of them already have children. So almost 60% of them already have children. So when you look at, again, at the history that private adoption was used as a way of delaying parenthood, it's no longer about delaying parenthood, right? They're already raising kids. It's about capacity to parent more. It's about, can I afford to have this additional child in my household? And it's increasingly a capacity and resource question. I include this is the gestational age at which they contact adoption agencies or attorneys. Most of them, half of them are in their third trimester, and more are actually contacting agencies at delivery or postpartum that are in the first or second trimester. So fewer than 20% are contacting agencies in their first or second trimester. This is important to understand because these women are no longer, when we talk about the question of abortion versus adoption, right? They're not seeking abortions. They're past the point in their pregnancy. By the time they're considering I always get it wrong at least once in a presentation where I say the wrong one, occupational hazard. They're no longer seeking abortion. They're no longer eligible for abortion in their home state or in most states in the United States, increasingly more states. They're contacting these agencies later in their pregnancies, usually at the point where parenting doesn't feel tenable for them. So, all right, here we go. To contextualize that, so in the United States, we have about 4 million births per year. We have about 850 to 900,000 abortions per year in the United States. The number has not gone down since Dobbs. The number of abortions in the United States has actually gone up since the Dobbs decision. That's an entirely different conversation that my demographer colleagues can answer. We've got some ideas, but it has not gone down since the Dobbs decision. In contrast, there are only about 20,000, between 18 and 22,000 private adoptions per year. So when we talk about adoption as an alternative to abortion, it's not even the same ballpark, right? The numbers of private domestic adoptions of infants are so small compared to the number of people who need access to abortion care and compared to the number of people who are birthing and intending to parent. Similarly, about 33% of women at some point in their lives will have an abortion. This is a little bit of an old number. It's a little lower. It's between 25 and 30 right now. But abortion just remains a very common reproductive experience. Of course, as does birth. 84% of American women will give birth at some point. Birth and abortion, pretty common. People do one or both of those things frequently at points in their lives. About 0.7% will place for adoption. I think this number is actually, if anything, that 0.7% is high. And that's because it doesn't take into account subsequent relinquishments. So women who have relinquished before are more likely to relinquish again. And so I would guess it's around actually 0.5%. But when you're talking about 0.5% versus 0.7%, like I'm the only person that's interested in that difference. So we have to recognize our audience. Yes. This is a graph. This just looks at the rates from 1980 to 2016. The top line is birth. Again, birth has always been very common. Abortion has always been really common. It's trending down. We've actually, the highest number of abortions were in the early 2000s. The abortion rate has gone down over the last 20, 25 years, largely just because long-acting reversible contraceptives, IUDs, are becoming more common and more effective than prior generations of contraceptives. And then the adoption rate is really low. This is a logarithmic graph, which actually makes it look closer together. But if I don't have a logarithmic graph, then you don't see the adoption line at all because it's so low. So it's a little confusing to people that the scale gets closer the higher up you go. But basically, abortion has always been more common than adoption, even when abortion was illegal and even during the height of the baby scoop era. So when we talk about these really high levels of coercive, closed, secretive, private adoptions that were pre-Roe v. Wade, that this was like a very extractive system. And you had very high numbers of private adoption compared to what we have today. Even then, you had 10 times as many abortions as you did adoptions. Abortion has always been more common than adoption. Women who are getting abortions are not interested in adoption. So this was a survey of 5,000 abortion patients on the day of their procedure. They were asked to rate the true, false, kind of statement here. I want to put the baby up for adoption instead of having an abortion. 99% said no. 1% said kind of. That leaves exactly 0 of them that said that was true. So this is just not an option that they're interested in. But what happens when you take away access to abortion, which we are doing a lot of these days? So this is a study, women seeking abortion. This is a study of about 1,000 women that were seeking abortions. 230 of them were turned away. So they showed up at the clinic to get their abortion on the day of their procedure, and they were not able to because usually they were past the gestational limit of the clinic or the state. We contrasted them with the 725 who were able to obtain their abortions. Of the 231 that were turned away, 161 gave birth, 146 were parenting. So even when you remove abortion access, when you say you cannot have an abortion, over 90% of them are going to be parenting instead of relinquishing for adoption. Only 15 of them relinquished. So what do these estimates mean post-Dobbs? A 9% relinquishment rate among those that are denied abortions, and we estimate about 100,000 abortions will be denied at some point. This hasn't happened yet, right? We haven't seen any individual people are certainly denied access to abortion in our post-Dobbs world, but the rate hasn't gone down. These were estimates that we made as soon as the decision was made and what we expect to see longer term. That would mean a 50% increase in private adoptions. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing, right? And it's because so many people need abortion care and there are already so few adoptions that even if a relatively small number of people choose adoption, it's a huge increase in the adoption rate. You're going to have far more people that are still getting their abortions. Among the people that are denied abortion care, you're going to have far, far more that are parenting as a result of that denial. So they're going to be raising children in circumstances with timing that they didn't choose. But you are going to see a meaningful increase in adoption, even if it's a relatively small number compared to the total number of people who are birthing or having abortions. Oh, and I'm so sorry. This is a little yelly. The font didn't translate with his presentation. I promise I'm not intending to yell at you, but I will just read this quick quote. So this is a woman who is Letitia, who's 26-year-old single mother when she was denied her abortion. And she said, I was like, if I feel like I'm going to just go full term, then I would just prefer to keep the baby. I don't want to have to know that I had a child out there in the world or whatever, that I done gave my baby away. No, I just felt either more comfortable with terminating it or just keeping it. I was not even going to do an adoption. It's not an option for me. Okay. This is Sophia's story. And I'm going to read a little bit more about Sophia. So Sophia grew up in Los Angeles. She was 19 years old when she got pregnant. She was very close with her Mexican-born Spanish-speaking mother. Her father was incarcerated for most of her life and then deported. So her mother relied on Sophia and her 3 older siblings for support and translation once they were priced out of their neighborhood and moved to a mostly white neighborhood further outside of the city. Her mother worked multiple jobs while her aunt would help with cooking and cleaning and childcare. We're a really strong family, Sophia shared. Whatever the situation happened, we really do have a lot of family that supports us. She spoke about how not having anything is good for us and how it helped her stay humble and learn a lot about life. Sophia was in school and working part-time to help support her family, including her younger siblings, who she practically raised, and felt like she couldn't fail. She knew her new boyfriend, who was 8 years older than she was distracting her from her work. And she also resented his constant need for her time and attention. When she began to have some abnormal bleeding, she went to the emergency room while her boyfriend stayed on the couch. Excellent co-parent. Could she be pregnant? The nurse in the ER asked her. She told them that she wasn't, not that she knew of, but an ultrasound, of course, revealed that she was. And it was in that moment, even though she recognized that she had no financial stability, an estranged boyfriend, and a deep anxiety, and a deep anxiety about increasing the burden on her mother, that she met the moment with joy. This is a quote from Sophia. I've always kept this. I'm always remembering this moment. It's not a sad moment for me. It's actually a happy moment, because deep down inside, I felt happy because I knew I was bringing something so beautiful into this world. And then when I stopped and thought about it, well, what happens if he doesn't want to be part of the baby's life? What am I going to do? Everything's going to fall on me. I saw my mother struggle. Did I really want to go through this? Is this the right moment? So many questions popped into my head at that first moment, and I was just confused. My 2 minutes of happiness that I felt drifted away slowly when I started realizing that bringing a child into this world was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And then Sophia says, I knew adoption was the best and only option that I had. And of course, if it's the only option that you have, you don't have any choice. This is Emily. So Emily was also 19. She was also in California. And she found out she was pregnant. And unlike Sophia, she really wanted to have an abortion right away. She tried to get an abortion. She found out that she was further along in her pregnancy than she expected. She wasn't able to access care. She went to 3 other clinics trying to save up money to afford further travels and a more expensive procedure. And then finally was told no one's doing this procedure. She said each time I went to a new clinic, they were like, oh no, we think you're too far along. So I was sent to another place and they would say, oh, you're too far along, but this person can do it. You're too far along, but this person. Finally, I was sent to a clinic in San Francisco, and I found out that nobody should have sent me anywhere because I was just too far along to begin with. At that last clinic, I did an ultrasound just to make sure. She did all the measurements. This nice lady tried to explain to me exactly, here's where the measurement should be if it was a possible procedure, and here's where you are. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but there's no way you're going to be able to have an abortion. You're going to have this baby. And I remember she looked at me and told me, you're going to have this baby. Like, get it through your head. Emily moved just a few hours away, but still the closest place that was far enough away, but still close to my family, and quickly became involved with a boyfriend that she described as a bit of an emotional crutch to help me cope with everything and to help me step away from my family. She acknowledged it wasn't necessarily a healthy relationship, but her boyfriend had recently lost his mother and thus understood her grief. She had recently lost her grandfather who had helped raise her. It also helped that he had grown up without a father. Emily felt they were coming from a similar place. Okay. Sorry. These slides are a little bit wonky. I apologize that these have not translated as smoothly. So this is Emily's quote: is, "If I couldn't have an abortion, then okay, I would definitely be doing open adoption." But while denying abortion care will increase the proportion of pregnant people that relinquish infants for adoption, most birth or first parents do not try to have abortions. So when you focus on this conversation of abortion consideration and then turning to adoption when it's not possible, you're ignoring the fact that most people who are relinquishing never try to get an abortion. So this is Haley. Haley was also, I don't know why I started with 3 19-year-olds, but here we are. Haley was also 19 when she found out she was pregnant. She had another child. She had a son when she was 15, and she had parented him. She felt that she was really proud of how she parented him, that she kind of turned her life around when she found out she was pregnant. She refocused on school. She graduated with a really high GPA. Then she found out she was pregnant again at 19. Her parents have been really supportive of her parenting her elder son, but they were not supportive this time around. And so she was struggling with that. But here's a quote from Haley. "I wanted to keep him, and I was going to keep him. I was going to get a job, and I started going back to college so that I could get a better job. I didn't need my parents, and I didn't need anyone else. And me and my older son and the baby, we were going to make it. And then when I was about 17 weeks pregnant, I was doing my homework in the car at the grocery store because they have free Wi-Fi. And I just suddenly burst into tears because I realized I couldn't take him. I couldn't take care of him." And so when you talk about this contrast between abortion and adoption that our politicians love, you're missing the fact of Haley, who never considered getting an abortion, wanted to parent. And she tells me this story about doing her homework in the front seat of the car. Her son is asleep, laying out in the back seat because this is where she can get access to Wi-Fi. And she's put in this position where parenting just feels very untenable. She has this moment of a break about halfway through her pregnancy, and that's when she reaches out to the adoption agency. This is Cassie. I think I'm actually going to move along because we're a little bit shorter on time, and I think you get that idea. But rarely was adoption the preferred course of action. It emerged as a solution when abortion was inaccessible or parenting felt impossible. Because I wanted to save a little bit of time to look, because I know with this room, you have a lot of people that are foster impacted and engaged in the foster care system. And so I wanted to look at the ways that private adoption and our family regulation systems are becoming more close. So the reason I gave you all that really long history at the beginning of this talk were to understand these as pretty separate systems that have impacted different communities of people throughout American history. But what I think is actually happening now is that we are seeing these systems converge in more and more ways. There's a lot of reasons that this is happening. I think the first one is that you can look at the demographic data of who's participating, right? We're seeing far more women of color that are participating in the private adoption system. And we're seeing increasingly that poverty is a driving factor within private adoption and capacity. We, of course, know that poverty is a driving contributor for why people are engaged in foster care and child welfare systems as well, why parenthood is policed more for Black and Brown communities, particularly poor communities. And so I think that that is the biggest driving factor, is that you have more and more people that are being targeted by both private and public adoption systems, and they're looking more and more similar to each other. I have this quote from a sociologist and adoptee, Elizabeth Raleigh, called "Selling Transracial Adoption," which I really recommend. It's definitely an academic read, but it's very good. And it looks at this transition for when I talk about how white the private adoption system was, and sort of the shift that made white families more willing and actually eager to adopt children of color. She sort of traces that historical trajectory, including international adoption and now within our public adoption system. But this is a quote from Raleigh's book. "Impoverished mothers struggling to feed their children were attempting to place their toddlers for private adoption, rather than having the state take them away and put them in foster care for neglect. One adoption attorney discussed this trend. They, the birth mothers, can't afford to have foster care come in and take custody of their children, so they want to have a plan for their children because they think it is a better plan than to have them in foster care. So what you have is you have this threat of child welfare family regulation systems that encourages or coerces or constrains women into participating in the private adoption system because they believe it's going to be a meaningfully different alternative. And again, apologize for the formatting here. So one of the women I interviewed is Jasmine. She's a Latina woman, and she was incarcerated when she found out she was pregnant again. She had already lost 2 older children to the foster care system because of her drug addiction, and open adoption seemed like a better option. This is a quote. I wasn't interested in adoption at all, but the people at the jail mentioned it. I knew I wasn't ready for a baby, but giving up a baby, I couldn't do that. But I was scared because I already lost custody of my 2 oldest. I don't know where they're at. At the time, I had already been, 3 or 4 years, but I hadn't heard from them at all. But as the weeks went by, I started thinking about my daughter and that I still hadn't lost completely, the daughter that she was pregnant with at the time. I'm going through CPS, Child Protective, no, not the one she's pregnant with, another toddler who she hadn't had her rights terminated on yet. I'm going through CPS, Child Protective Services with her, and I hadn't lost her completely. And I just decided I need to focus on her. So I decided to do an open adoption for the baby so that at least I could see the baby. I told the person in the jail to call the agency, and they did. And I talked to them within a day or 2. I was actually surprised how fast, because it's usually really hard to get mail here, but it wasn't hard to get mail from the adoption agency. I got a package from them with profiles to read in my cell. Because mothers like Jasmine are already involved in the family regulation system, of course, they are facing increased scrutiny of their parenting and in policing of their families. So when they're expecting a new child, they may not know that it's possible or even likely that they will lose custody of the new child to the state, and they choose open adoption instead. This is a picture from outside the Supreme Court while they were hearing arguments in the Brackeen versus Holland case, Holland versus Brackeen. This case had like 5 different names over the course of its hearing. I use Holland versus Brackeen in the end. This was a case that came out of the Texas Department of Children and Families, spacing on what the Texas Department that manages is held, but so be it. You had a white couple, obviously non-tribal members, Jennifer and Chad Brackeen. They had adopted a Native child when they found out that their child's mother was pregnant again, and they wanted to adopt the new baby. And I'm here for this work, I'm relying on the reporting of Rebecca Nagel, who does the podcast This Land. The entire season 2 of This Land is on the Holland versus Brackeen case. It's incredible reporting, and if you haven't listened to it, it's like listening to a thriller that we know has a happy ending, so you can actually enjoy it. But this pattern that I saw with Jasmine was of offering incarcerated women open adoptions to Relinquished is not an anomaly. As reported by Rebecca Nagel on her podcast, This Land, an offer of open adoption is how Jennifer and Chad Brackeen gained standing in the child custody case that would become Holland versus Brackeen, the case that challenged the legality of the Indian Child Welfare Act before the Supreme Court in November 2022. The case involved custody of Yoselin, which is a pseudonym, the biological sister of the Brackeen's adopted son. As Nagel reports, after crying at the news of Yoselin's birth, Jennifer Brackeen decided that she had to fight for custody of a child that she had not fostered over that child's blood relative. So the girl, Yoselin's biological grandmother, who's a tribal member, wanted to foster her, but the Brackeens thought that they should. At first, Chad and Jennifer Brackeen contacted the Texas Department of Family. Okay, apologies, this is getting cut off. Give me one quick minute. These tech transitions are always a little rocky. Come on. Okay. At first, Chad and Jennifer Brackeen contacted the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, but social workers wouldn't give them information about the baby because it wasn't their baby. So their lawyer sent a letter to the Deputy Commissioner of Texas DFPS, but the department wouldn't budge. They wouldn't place Yoselin with the Brackeens. So Jennifer tracked down Yoselin's mother in jail and got her to sign an affidavit that she wanted the Brackens to adopt Yoselin. Yoselin's caseworker would later testify that the Brackens got that affidavit by promising Yoselin's mom an open adoption, meaning that she could always have contact with the baby. The caseworker said that was concerning. Chad and Jennifer used that affidavit to help get standing in Yoselin's case. In other words, to have a say in what happened to her. The practice of offering open adoption as a way of averting foster care is also practiced in more progressive adoption spaces. So you'll see a lot of adoption agencies now, because again, this is a high demand, right? We have a lot of people who want to adopt. We have very few babies available. Agencies are motivated to find ways of making babies available within the private adoption system because that's how markets work. And one way that they do is they target women who have already lost older children to foster care, regardless of the circumstances of their life now, regardless of what the conditions of this pregnancy look like, and say, you're probably going to lose this baby to foster care. But if you finalize a private adoption now, then we can arrange an open adoption where you'll be able to pick out the parents, you'll be able to know where the child is, and you'll be able to have openness. Now, openness is not legally binding in most private adoptions. It's very, very rare to find one that is. It's especially rare to find one that is actually has that openness enforced, right? But this openness is sort of used as a carrot, as a way of saying, if you're going to have a separation from this child anyway, if you participate in this system, you might have more control over it. And I think that in these circumstances, we need to remember that this isn't a foregone conclusion that they're going to be separated from this child, right? And if they are, and there's a way to maintain greater control and dignity, that's a very different situation than assuming that all mothers who've lost all their children to foster care are inevitably going to lose all future children to foster care. And this is Camille's story. Because Camille had a little bit of a different relationship. And I'm just going to read briefly because I know we are about at time. So Camille was recently divorced. She had 3 children. When she became pregnant again, she was really good co-parents with her ex-husband. But during the course of her pregnancy with her new boyfriend, her ex-husband passed away. So she no longer had a co-parent for the older children that she was raising. And so she was fully in single mom mode. When I found out I was pregnant, it wasn't planned, obviously, but it was a happy thing for me. I was excited when I found out. But I was facing single motherhood and my kid's father had passed away, so it was a hard situation. I started having problems with depression around that time. I was just not well. I wasn't eating, I wasn't drinking. It was just not good. The doctor was aware. I told her and she just tried to encourage me. I don't know if she got me on medication then or after, but they knew about the death of my ex-husband and that we were pretty close. It just affected me really badly and I just couldn't connect with the baby when he was born. There were times when he was a newborn and he would wake up and I would feed him and I would try to put him back to sleep right away because I couldn't handle him being awake. When I did take care of him, I did it really, really carefully, almost methodically. I didn't miss a beat, but I was doing it like I was watching someone else do it, almost an out-of-body experience. I thought everything would be okay eventually, but it was a hard time. I was really isolated. I didn't have a job. I didn't have any support where I was living, and my family's not here. It was really rough. My thoughts, they progressed from just regular depression to having delusions, not understanding what was going on. Then those thoughts started to progress, and I would have thoughts of hurting my son. I knew it wasn't right to have thoughts like that. He was maybe 2 months, 1 or 2 months. I can't remember exactly when the thoughts started like getting really bad because they didn't crowd out my thoughts all at once. I would just be like, thought here, thought there. And then he'd be in the tub and I would have the thought of letting him drown. And I was just like, that's not right. At some point, the thoughts got worse and I felt hopeless in my situation. I didn't have anybody to talk to and I was scared. This is not normal. I can't talk to people about this. They'll just take all my kids. It wasn't logical. Later on, I obviously found out it was postpartum psychosis, but at the time, I didn't know what was going on. I was just like, what is wrong with me? I was so scared about everything, about them taking my kids because of my ex passing all of a sudden. There wasn't another parent for my older children. That's when the fear crept in that I could lose all 3 of my kids that were still at home with me. I didn't feel like anybody would help me. For me, as an adoptee myself, this is all I have, my children. I couldn't lose them, and I didn't feel like Child Protective Services would work with me, so I didn't tell anybody. If I could do it over, I would tell someone and believe that hopefully they would get me counseling. But at the time, I was just so scared that I didn't tell anybody. I hadn't planned on adoption at all. I've raised 3 other kids, so it wasn't easy to just give up. But I finally placed him in January 2018. He had been born the summer before. I remember all that fall, I started calling around to different agencies just to get some information, to start getting profiles sent to me. I hinted to some friends that what I was doing, and they were just like, "Oh, it'll get better." They didn't know exactly what was going on. They just thought that I was overwhelmed and having a new baby, which I was, but it was more than that. I had a lot of fear, not just of hurting me, but I would go out in public and think people were judging me and watching me. It wasn't normal, that anxiety. It was overwhelming. When I started looking into adoption online, it felt unreal because the adoptive parent profiles looked so perfect. It didn't feel real. I started learning more and more about it, and things got more and more desperate. I called the agency and started to talk to someone, and she was really nice, made me feel like I could talk to someone. She set up an appointment to meet with an adoption specialist who came out to my house. We talked, and she was wonderful, and she said that she had the perfect family for what I wanted. They lived just a few hours away, and they had just had another baby. I had been looking for a Black family and said that if I couldn't find a Black family for him, I just wouldn't do it. But not a lot of Black families do private adoptions, I guess, maybe because it's so expensive or it's just our beliefs. But it was hard because he was a few months old. He wasn't a newborn. People want to go to the hospital and come home with the baby, even if they didn't give birth. They want you to have the baby, spend a few hours, and then give them their baby. They don't want a baby that's 6 months old, used to some other mother, which is, I guess, pretty understandable. It's just so sad to think about. But I realized at the time that it was like going to the store. Do you want a brand new object or do you want a used one? The bidding goes down because he wasn't brand new. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but that's what I learned. That was my truth about it. The family the agency lady found, though, wasn't a Black family. They were white, but they'd already adopted one Black baby. And so I was worried that I wouldn't be able to keep him safe, and worried that I wouldn't find another family that I thought, well, at least he would grow up with a brother or sister of his own race. So when we started communicating with that family, even though it was still iffy, I just kind of jumped in. They started visiting a lot, and they would come with me to a lot of his doctor's appointments. They would drive hours to come to his appointments, and they helped drive me to some of his specialist appointments that were further away. I feel like they were pretty dedicated. And at this point, I felt a little obligated. I felt like I couldn't go back and forth. I just pushed myself to keep going. That's what I did. The adoption was supposed to be open. That was really the only way I would do it. If it was very open. They wanted even more openness than I thought was possible. They were saying that we could visit several times a year. They said maybe I could move closer to them, saying that would be awesome. You could see him even more. You'd be like extended family and could help him with all his other race stuff. They were saying all that stuff. But once the adoption was finalized, I also still didn't know what the heck was wrong with me. And the idea of not having to care for him every day, I felt like I had the courage to find out. I thought, okay, if I don't have him, the least I can do is get well so that when I see him again, I can be better and he can be proud of me. I started going to the hospital for mental health reasons, and I told them that. I started telling them everything I'd been through, and it scared them. We had pretty decent communication for those first few months that they had custody, but pretty much as soon as the adoption was finalized, the communication was cut off. I didn't know that open adoption wasn't a legal thing. They started ghosting me, and I just got frustrated, and I kind of went off a bit, and I said, that's not what this was supposed to be. And that conflict severed the relationship. I haven't seen him now in over a year, and so that was not part of the deal at all. I wish it had been more like the picture that was painted, like an extended family stuff and like that. I just feel like I was kind of lied to. And I feel like it was all these fluffy things to get me to do it. And then when it was done, I was thrown out. I was cast out. I'm not saying I wanted them to call me every day or anything like that. I just wanted more planned meetings, something I can plan my life around. Now I feel like they're going to ice me out if I ask them again, maybe emailing them and say like, hey, am I ever going to see him again? I was scared to even ask that because then maybe they wouldn't even send me a picture anymore. I continue to get counseling, and I talk to someone 3 or 4 times a week, so it's pretty intense. I feel like it was very brave for me to do what I did. I feel like it was the best I could do with what I had. I did the best that I could have done for all my kids at the time. I feel like I wish that I picked a different family. I know that's harsh to say, but at the same time, I get pictures of the agency, and he's happy, he's clean, he's doing well. He has horses and dogs, he's happy. That's all that matters. I think my story really needs to be told because women end up in prison for thoughts like I had. And I'm glad I found the right thing to do no matter what. Because the other part of me thought to just deal with it. Like everybody said, you'll get through it. No, sometimes you won't get through it. Although it didn't go as I planned, maybe it'll change. Maybe it'll get better. I still have hope that the story is not over, and I'll be able to see him and everything will be okay, and it'll all be worth it. So that's Camille's story. And what I think is important, I mean, there's a lot that's important, is why I include it at the length I did, both in the book and in this conversation. Because here you can really see the way that she found the child welfare system so untrustworthy, right? She was worried that if she turned to child welfare, she'd lose all of her children. And this was her way of keeping as much of her family together as she could. And the way that private adoption is framed as open, as you having more control, none of that is actually enforceable in the long term or necessarily even supported, right? So a lot of the mothers I spoke with, they had families that didn't cut them off the same way that Camille's son's adoptive family did. But they just got busy. They didn't make it a priority. They didn't have the tools to negotiate, to stay connected, to get through challenges. And you can understand, right? Like, this is a scary, I mean, Camille would have been the first person to say that she was, I'm not a safe parent for this baby right now, right? I need help. I need someone else's help with this baby. And you can understand from the adoptive family's perspective of like, you have this new baby that you're tasked with like keeping safe and raising, and to hear a mother say, yeah, I went through postpartum psychosis and I had these thoughts about hurting him. Like, you can kind of understand the impulse to be like, okay, well, you're not coming near this baby, right? But you have to recognize that like that, one, that's not what she was led to believe. It's a fundamental changing of the conditions that she agreed to at the separation. But it also doesn't recognize the value of connection for the child as he grows, right? It considers openness and ongoing connection solely as a favor to the relinquishing parents, right? Rather than something that's going to serve the adoptive person over the course of their life. And I think when you look at the increasing interactions of the private system and the family regulation, child welfare systems, you see the way that family regulation continues to be a threat in how people assess where they can seek support, what their options actually are, who they can rely on and trust, and what it will mean for their whole family. And, you know, when I asked Camille, like, how do you feel about this choice that you made now looking back a couple years later? She says, I made the best choice for all of my kids, right? She doesn't feel good about the adoption, right? She's certainly not happy with how it's going now. It's not meeting her expectations, but she still feels like this is how she was going to keep her older children with her. And so I think that that's really critical looking forward. I also want to just end looking more broadly at adoption in the context of reproductive justice. This is the movement that I have come out of in my own work. I know a lot of people come to this from different social frameworks, movement homes. But I do think that it's important to find ways of bringing conversations about adoption into other movement spaces, because that's how you're actually going to build coalition to get changes made, right? That's how you're actually, by sort of recognizing those connections and moving forward. So I see a huge amount of connection between the private adoption system, the family regulation and policing systems. The policing system, not just family policing, but policing carceral systems more broadly, and then abortion bans and the criminalization of pregnancy, right? These are all about the conditions under which we work to keep families together, or where we are very willing to separate families, who we decide is as a parent that is worth supporting, and who we decide is a parent that is unworthy of their children, and we don't see a value in preserving that. I also try to draw a pretty clear distinction around the right. People always ask me, like, well, is there a right to parent? Because reproductive justice articulates the right to parent the children that we have, right? Which makes demands of certain community structures, right? Which says if you have a right to parent your children, that means that you have a right to a safe community in which you raise them, right? It means that you have a right to the resources that will enable you to parent and raise your children the way you want to. And I think it's important to differentiate that from a right to parent and the right to parent the children you have. Because if we say that people have a right to parent, we as a society have an obligation to meet that right. If someone has a right to something, then we have an obligation to protect that right. You have a right to vote, we have an obligation to make sure that you can vote, to make it easy and free and accessible, right? If you have a right to healthcare, we're still working on this one. We have a right to make sure you can actually get the healthcare that you need, right? And to meet that need. So if we say you have a right to parent, that means that you have a right to children. I don't think people have a right to children, right? I think that we have to pull that apart. But I do think that there's a distinct right to raise the children that are born to you, and to have the communities and the resources and the supports that you need to do that. And I think that when we talk about conversations around family preservation, what families need to be successful, we have to recognize we're really talking about poverty, because that's what's driving so much of family separation in both public and private contexts. And if we are going to make investments in these families, you're going to be elevating millions of American families that are living in poverty that are not actually at risk of family separation either, right? Because they're protected in some way, or they have some basic level of stability, even if they're still going paycheck to paycheck, or day to day with their bills, right? They're still going to be benefit from just creating a better social safety net. That's going to benefit far, too much talking with my hands. It's going to be far more families than those who are actually directly vulnerable to family separation. And I think that additionally, we have to recognize that when we talk about issues of choice, right? And this is again coming back to the abortion conversation. When people are like, oh, you have these 3 choices. You can parent, or you can have an abortion, or you can relinquish the baby for adoption. They don't use relinquish. You can place the child for adoption. None of that is recognizing the constraints, the social constraints that we put on people that limit their autonomy, that limit the choices that are available to them. And if we want people to have actual control over their reproductive lives and their families, and be able to advocate for what they need to keep their families together, we need to recognize the way that the system keeps those options narrow. And then the final question is like, what does it take to build a movement? And this is why I like to start out with looking at the different racialized trajectories of different systems of adoption, because I think that has really limited our ability to build a robust multiracial coalition around change, harm reduction, preservation, abolition, whatever your approach is. It's going to take a lot of conversations with people who have historically not been in the same room, right? So I've talked to a lot of mothers who have relinquished babies for private adoption. They're particularly women who are older, white women, and they look at women who are engaged in the child welfare system, and they're like, well, those women lost their kids because they're like bad mothers, right? And you look at women of color that are disproportionately impacted by the family regulation system, and they're like, okay, but those people like chose to give up their babies, right? And you don't have a recognition of the commonalities in what constrains people's choices and autonomy and rights. And I'm not saying they're the same. Like, I'm not trying to erase all that very long historical difference. I think that we need to see it, but we also need to see what's common so that you can create these coalitions, so that you can build these movements, so we can actually make sure that we are caring for families the way that we intend to in this country. So that's me. This is the book. My email is up here. You can probably the easiest way to reach out to me is just to message me on Twitter or Instagram. I'm there more than I am on my email at this point. So if and would love to be in ongoing conversation with you all in your work. I'm really grateful to be here this morning. Thank you for having me. Anything? Yeah. A few for questions. You're the boss, so you tell me what we have time for. Okay. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yes. Thank you.
I think that is true. I think it's complicated, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm working for biological family, adoptive family.
There, can I just add one quick caveat? So there exists the possibility of enforceable contact agreements in 12 states. I believe it's 12, might have gone up just with the last legislative session. But what we found is that, and I'm not a lawyer, so I should stop talking now, but I'm going to go on just a little bit further. Even in some states where you can have a legally binding openness agreement, doesn't necessarily mean that you will, right? So in Texas, there exists the possibility of having legally binding contact agreements, but a lot of time private agencies will say, look, you could have a legally binding contact agreement, but what we really want is for you to just have an open relationship with this family. And we think the contracts like might, right. So you can, it doesn't mean that it's required to have a legally open, right. And there's also the question of the enforcement mechanism. So if the parents do cut off contact and the relinquishing family can't afford an attorney to challenge that, right. So I think that some legal enforceability is important, and I don't want to, it does exist in some places, but it looks very different depending on state by state.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. And again, I know it's really complicated. I wish the first sentence that said in the post-adoption context, if there's no contact in a year, then it's all bets are off. And I want to make sure that was not in any of the context. Super complicated. My other question to me is the whole abortion versus adoption. And if the adoption rates increase, even though there's a tiny number, but significant statistical, Panini told me you're right. And that really irritates me and makes me very worried about how that, how those statistics further reduce access to healthcare and access to abortion.
Yeah. Yes. Look, I wrote this book to prove any kind of about wrong. So that take like that one's important to me. I mean adoption rate, if they are going to go up, they are going to go up. They haven't, well, but also we don't count adoptions on a federal level in this country. So like there's a bill in Congress right now to actually do that. So it's going to be tricky, and the bill is like okay, but it's not as legally fine as I would like it to be, because like the most common type of private adoption is step parent adoption, which is completely different than everything that we're talking about today, right? So you need to separate these different numbers out. But when you constrain choices, when you make abortion unavailable, when you make parenting impossible, you're going to have more adoptions, right? Adoption is a path of constraints. You don't have anything else. If you don't have anything else that's possible, that's what you're going to do. So it's going to go up, but that doesn't mean, I mean, to me, Justice Breyer is saying like, this is just as good of an option. Like people will choose this. They won't choose it, but you can make them do it, right? If you take everything else off the table. And so to me, a higher rate of relinquishment isn't an expression of people making an empowered choice that the justice seems to want it to be. But oh yeah, people believe wrong things all the time. Yeah, no, I think yeah, no, I think that's true. But that's why I think it's important for like those people who are impacted, like people who understand this, to push back on that, right? And to recognize these circumstances, right? And I also want to say, like, there are people who disagree with the justice, we like a lot of conservatives believe this, right? I can talk about Justice Breyer all day, but she's not alone, right? But I also think that she's not even alone across the political spectrum, right? Like I start the book, like Barack Obama includes promoting adoption in his Roe v. Wade anniversary statement, right? Like I've talked to United States senators that are authoring the adoption tax credit, and they're like, oh, we've never thought about private adoption as different from public adoption systems. I'm like, you're literally writing federal policy on this, right? Like these are Democrats. I don't talk to Republicans. Sorry, this is probably a C3 room. I should tone it down. But my point is that there are plenty of people like center and left of center that believe things that are fundamentally inaccurate about adoption and reproductive autonomy more broadly, and how these systems work and who they serve and who they're designed to serve and how well they're doing that. And like, I think that's where I'm like, that's my audience, right? Is people who share values with me, and can have, and where we can move the conversation forward, people who will be moved by evidence, right? I come across plenty of conservative people who are like, oh, poor people just shouldn't be having kids. And I'm like, I'm not talking to you, right? And I always say like, but I mean, like, I will have a conversation with anyone, but that's not who my argument is tailored for. My argument is for people who are coming from a place of, what does real support look like? What does a meaningful social safety net look like? how are we best going to support children and families long term? And I think that's who can be compelled by evidence. Yes.
I'm struggling to form my question, so bear with me. But back before Dobbs, there was some talk in the pro-life spaces about abortion leading to a syndrome of grief that was never really real, and no acknowledgement of birth parent grief that we all, those of us who work with birth parents, experience all the time. And I'm wondering about that in the political world that you're
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. No, people are always be like, well, everything that you're saying about adoption, people in the anti-abortion movement say is true about adoption when they talk about like coercion and profit motives and regret. And I'm like, okay, one, I have evidence. And they don't. But also like they act like that's like a gotcha moment. And I'm like, oh yeah, but this is true. And I think that is also important to pull apart. Right. And I when I did a book event in Washington, DC, and I was like, look, I just think adoption should be safe, legal, and rare. And which is like this like sort of 1990s rhetoric around adoption, right? Is like, what does it actually take to reduce harm within the system, to keep families together as much as possible, to offer the people who need legal protection the legal protection? Like, how do we right size this and reduce harm within what remains? I think that's really important. And that's why I don't come out. Someone was like, oh, well, you're stigmatizing adoption. I'm like, and the decisions that these women are making. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the women who share their stories with me. And I hope that those of you who have read my work, that comes across, right? I'm not stigmatizing them for the choices that they are making. I'm not saying that they made bad choices. I think that they had bad options available to them and they did the best that they could. And it is incumbent on the rest of us to figure out how to make sure that people have access to the power and control over their own circumstances so that they have real choices available to them. I'm not out here trying to make adoption illegal the same way that anti-abortion people are trying to make abortion illegal. I'm trying to make adoption unnecessary as much as possible.
One more question? All right. And if there's no more questions, we got one more question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not advocating for leaving children in unsafe situations. And I always say, I have full respect for the fact that not every person can parent every child that's born to them at every point in their life, right? But the example I gave, I talked with one mother, she wasn't a participant. We were talking about the work after it came out. And she said, well, I didn't relinquish due to poverty. I just didn't have, she was 16 years old when she relinquished. Like, I just didn't have a safe home to bring the baby to. And I said, okay, was it safe for you? And she's like, oh no, of course not. I was like, well, then we've already failed, right? There are some times when it is going to be necessary for children to be raised by people other than their biological families. Like, I have respect for that. But when you talk about entire systems of change, right, you're talking about how to think about this more broadly, right? So people who are incarcerated obviously are not going to be able to care for children at that point. People who are very deep in positions of addiction are not going to be able to be safe and reliable parents for their children the way that they need to be. But as a society, we've already failed those people at that point, right? When we look at the over-policing and incarceration of certain communities, when we look at who the opioid epidemic is most impacting, right? Now, adoption can be approximate harm reduction measure in those cases. I think that we still need to be rethinking like kinship placements, what it means to keep children in communities where they are, how we're supporting these families long-term, how we're providing ongoing connections to family of origins to the extent that they're safe. But when you talk about these really deep entrenched problems, that's where the opportunity to build coalition comes in, right? And where it makes sense to draw connections to these other broader movements for social change to envision what community safety means more broadly. These are not easy problems to solve. I'm not suggesting that they are, and I'm not suggesting that we need to just like leave children at risk while we're like figuring out decarceration. Like, no, that's going to take a generation or a century, probably more. But in the meantime, how do we reduce harm? How do we provide connection, and how do we support families as a whole? So,
Well, thank you for all the thought. Really appreciate having you here.
of course, thanks for having me.
And and you'll be leaving shortly, right? So.
Yeah.
And you have some
And there-
books in the
I
back,
brought
though,
a
right?
few. I brought a few
Okay.
books. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
There's what there is, they're on the book table. There's this one, and when they're gone, they're gone.
I will also say I gave a talk last week. There was an ordering mess up. I ended up with just a ton of extra books, which is fine. So I'm going to be doing a giveaway on my social media for adopted people or impacted people. So I just have a ton of extra books. So feel free to connect with me there if you are an adoptee or you want a copy of the book. They really only have a few here. So but I'll be doing that probably next week. So happy to get you a book if you need a book. Yes. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you all.
So let's break for lunch. Our staff should get together so we can have a picture.